In the quiet outskirts of a small township near Mathath Eastern Cape, there lived a man who never shouted to be seen. He never wore fancy suits, never stepped onto global stages, and certainly never claimed fame. Most people walked past him as if he were just another village tinkerer, with oil-stained hands and wire scraps in his pockets. But buried deep in his story is an invention that would go on to power communication towers, inspire battery technology, and shape lives far beyond Africa's shores. The tragedy? The world never gave him credit. His name was Teboho Mokoena, a name that rarely shows up in science journals. A name not found in school textbooks, but it should be. Long before smartphones buzzed in our palms and wireless devices ruled our world, Teboho was solving problems no one asked him to solve but everyone would eventually benefit from. He wasn't trained in Europe or mentored by Silicon Valley. His laboratory was a makeshift shed built from old zinc sheets, plastic bags to block the rain, and a battery-powered light that flickered through the night. He was, by all accounts, just a village boy with a wild imagination, as the local kids used to call it. They'd laugh as he wandered the markets collecting broken radios, bicycle parts, and pieces of glass anything others had thrown away. "One day I'll make something they won't be able to ignore," he told his younger sister Thandi, after being kicked out of yet another classroom for asking too many questions. And maybe that's where this story begins, not with a grand discovery, but with a boy whose questions were too big for the room. He was 11 when he first took apart a government-issued transistor radio. His mother had won it in a church raffle, and to her horror, he dismantled it just 2 days later. She beat him, of course lightly, but with tears in her eyes. "Why can't you just leave things as they are?" she cried. But Teboho never liked things as they are. By the age of 15, he had built a makeshift wind turbine, using bicycle spokes, an old fan motor, and palm fronds. It powered a single light bulb in their home, and for that entire month, his family didn't need candles. No one in his township had seen anything like it. People came to see it. Some clapped, others called it witchcraft. But one man, a traveling teacher named Mr. Kumalo, stayed behind. "You didn't copy this from a book?" Kumalo asked, his brows raised. Teboho just smiled. "I don't read the books you mean. I read problems. I solve what I see." That wind turbine was the beginning, but not the kind of beginning that brings applause. In Africa, stories like Teboho's often bloom in silence. They struggle under systems that ignore them, under governments that lack the infrastructure to protect genius, and under economies that sell ideas to the highest bidder without asking whose hands first shaped them. So here's a question. How did a poor, self-taught teen from rural South Africa design an energy system that would later be patented by someone else halfway across the world? What happened to his drawings? His prototypes? Why did his name vanish just as his ideas took flight? Because someone was watching, and someone was listening. Years later, pieces of Teboho's work would show up eerily similar in tech labs in Germany and Canada. A modular battery that could charge using movement. A wireless signal amplifier made from crushed stone and copper. Ideas dismissed as primitive in his village suddenly became breakthroughs overseas. And the worst part? He knew. "I once sent letters," he whispered to a friend, years later. "They laughed at my grammar. But they never laughed at the designs." Imagine knowing the world is using your brilliance, but calling it someone else's. Imagine walking past a satellite tower knowing you helped shape the core of its signal but being too poor to own a mobile phone. That was Teboho's reality. And yet, this isn't a story of defeat. It's something more haunting and more powerful, because Teboho never stopped inventing. Even when the world took his ideas, he kept creating. Not because he wanted fame, but because he couldn't not create. You see, in the corners of Africa, there are thousands like him. People who see the world differently. People who take discarded scrap and transform it into systems. People who dream in wires and translate pain into progress. People whose genius has been stolen again and again. But Teboho's story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a mirror held up to a world that chooses which brilliance it sees and which it silences. And maybe that's why we must tell this story now. Not just to honor him, but to protect the next Teboho before the world forgets again. So, who was this man really? What did he invent? And how did his ideas travel continents without him? We're about to find out. And when we do, you may never look at innovation the same way again. The mornings in Qunu were cold, but Teboho Mokoena always woke up before the sun. His mother's kerosene stove hissed softly from the corner of their tiny kitchen, the flames licking at the bottom of an old iron kettle. He'd sit there, silent, waiting for the water to boil so he could wash his face before heading out. His mother, Madlamine, always spoke gently in the mornings, one of the few times the house was quiet enough for her to talk without shouting over younger siblings. She used to say, "God hides answers in the cracks of the day. That's why you have to wake up early." He took those words seriously. By sunrise, he was already scouring the roadside for copper wires. It wasn't garbage to him, it was potential. Broken cassette tapes, radio backplates, aluminum foil, each thing sparked a new idea. In his mind, everything had a purpose, but to the rest of the village, he was just the strange boy with the junk bag. Qunu was not a place for dreamers. It was a place for surviving. Most of the boys Teboho's age had already dropped out of school. Some had joined taxi gangs. Others worked long hours as mechanics, hustling for spare change. Education wasn't a priority, it was a privilege. One that many felt was wasted on someone like Teboho, who always seemed lost in thought, muttering equations to himself in the fields. But if you followed him after school, you'd see a different boy entirely. In a cramped space behind their two-room home, covered with torn tarps and weighed down by rocks, stood his secret haven, his workshop. Inside, it was chaos to anyone else. But to Teboho, it was a symphony of gears and circuits. Wires curled around rusted nails like vines. Chalk marks covered the walls, forming strange diagrams, power systems, antennae structures, motion patterns. He had no textbooks. Only 2 old issues of Popular Mechanics, given to him by a retired teacher years before. He treated them like holy scripture, sleeping with them under his mattress, rereading them until the pages turned yellow. And yet, for all his passion, Teboho was alone in it. His father had died when he was 6, and since then, his family barely scraped by. His older brother Sifo thought he was wasting time. All these wires? And yet we can't even afford meat, Sifo would say. Build us a fridge. Genius. The community didn't believe in dreams that couldn't be measured in bread or jobs. The local counselor once told him, "This is not America. Here, we need plumbers and nurses, not daydreamers with batteries." But Teboho didn't argue. He just listened and went back to building. What he was working on in those years would later stun engineers in Europe. At just 17, he was already prototyping a kinetic energy converter using vibration to store power. It was crude, made from scrap metal, stones, and wires torn from an old generator. But it worked. He charged a torchlight with it. For the first time, his family didn't need to buy batteries that month. He named the project uKhanya, meaning light in his, but he had no one to show it to. He tried to enter a regional science fair once, borrowing a neighbor's phone to submit a handwritten entry. But when he arrived at the venue, dressed in his cleanest shirt and borrowed shoes, he was turned away. "Where's your school's letter? Where's your data sheet?" the administrator asked coldly. He had none. only the device in his hands, and a heart full of hope. He walked the 8 kilometers home in silence that day, and when his mother asked what happened, he just smiled. "They weren't ready," he whispered. But rejection became routine. He once wrote to the Department of Science and Innovation in Pretoria, enclosing rough sketches of a solar grid battery he believed could power an entire classroom. A month later, he received a reply. "Your submission does not meet the necessary technical standards for review." He didn't know what that meant. He just knew they didn't want to see what he saw. And still, he kept building. The main conflict wasn't that Teboho lacked ideas. It was that the world around him lacked vision, or perhaps the willingness to believe that brilliance could come from someone like him. A poor black boy in a village known more for goats than gadgets. A child without a lab coat or a degree. A creator without a title. But perhaps what hurt the most wasn't the disbelief. It was the betrayal. At 19, Teboho trusted someone he shouldn't. To have a foreign visitor who had come through the village as part of an NGO outreach program. The man, a Canadian consultant named Eric Mallory, claimed to be interested in local solutions to energy poverty. Teboho showed him everything. His journals, his sketches, his prototypes, even the original uKhanya converter. He said I was brilliant, Teboho told his sister afterward. He took photos, said he'd connect me to people who could help. I believed him. But Eric never wrote back. And 3 years later, a patent with his name appeared describing a modular vibration-charged energy pack for off-grid communities. The diagrams were eerily familiar. Teboho saw it online at a friend's internet cafe. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stared at the screen and whispered, "So they were ready. Just not for me." This was the wound that never healed. Not the poverty, not the loneliness, but the feeling of being invisible, even when your ideas light up the world. And yet, through all of it, he never stopped. Even when his hands were cracked and blackened from hours of work. Even when his dreams were picked clean by others and repackaged with foreign names. He kept going. Because for Teboho, invention was never about recognition. It was about freedom. It had been almost 2 years since the patent incident. 2 years of Teboho watching a stranger's name sit on what felt like his future. The light in his eyes hadn't completely gone out, but it dimmed. He still worked on his ideas, but no longer with the same hunger. The joy that used to come with every spark, every buzz of a new device had faded into quiet frustration. Most nights he just sat under the fig tree behind their home, scribbling sketches by candlelight, knowing full well they might never leave those pages. But sometimes, the universe sends someone unexpected, not with a solution, but with belief. Her name was Zanel Gumid, a postgraduate engineering student from the University of Cape Town, on a break between semesters. She had come to Qunu with her thesis group, studying rural access to sustainable power. She wasn't supposed to visit Teboho's part of the village at all, but a broken minibus and a storm changed her plans. She ended up staying overnight in a community hall near Teboho's home. That night, as she sat under the leaking roof, charging her phone with a solar panel pack, she noticed a faint hum nearby. A strange, rhythmic, buzzing like a wind-up toy trying to breathe. She followed the sound. It led her to Teboho's shed. Inside, she found him crouched beside a dusty metal box, carefully adjusting copper coils. There were no lights in the shed, yet the glow from a small rotating cylinder illuminated his hands. "You're using kinetic oscillation," she blurted out. Teboho looked up, startled. "No," he replied cautiously. "I'm using motion." She laughed softly. "Same thing. Sort of." It was the first time anyone had spoken his language in years. They sat and talked for hours. He showed her the uKhanya device, version 6.3. which now included a vibration teat, conversion platelet to keep medical vaccines from freezing during cold nights. He didn't know the physics terms. He didn't need to. Zanel saw it instantly. This was an imitation. This was innovation. You've built all of this alone? She asked. He nodded. No one ever stayed long enough to help. The next morning, she didn't leave. Not yet. Zanel called her professor from the school's only landline, begging for more time. She wanted to test Teboho's devices. Within a week, she had documented his schematics, recorded videos of his prototypes, and sent them back to her university lab. Her professor didn't believe it at first. He made this from scrap. Yes, she replied. And it works. By the end of the month, Zanel and her team returned, this time with tools, proper measuring equipment, and a laptop loaded with software Teboho had never seen. But the moment he laid eyes on the simulations, it was like watching a door open. So, that's what my formula looks like when it's printed, he whispered. What followed next was a whirlwind. Zanel published a research note, crediting Teboho's work as the foundation for a new model of decentralized microenergy grids. It wasn't just academic praise, it was practical recognition. The model had potential to power off-grid clinics, schools, and disaster zones, using simple materials and no fossil fuels. For the first time, his name appeared next to words like pioneer and African energy innovator. But even then, Teboho hesitated. He was still afraid to trust. What if they steal it again? He asked Zanel one evening, his voice barely audible. She looked at him and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. They might. But not if you step into the light first. With her help, he applied for an intellectual property certificate through a South African startup accelerator. It wasn't easy. There were interviews, technical reviews, legal forms that needed witnesses. But with each step, Teboho began to believe again. Slowly, cautiously. Then came the big moment. A TEDscape Town event sent Zanel an invitation to speak about rural innovation. She asked if she could bring someone with her. Teboho wasn't sure. I don't talk in front of people, he said. You don't have to, she replied. Just show them what you've built. On stage, in front of 400 people, with cameras recording and lights shining, he stood beside her. He didn't say much, just pressed a button. The kinetic converter blinked to life. The light bulb turned on. The room went silent. Then applause. Loud, long, real. After the talk, a woman from the United Nations Development Program approached them. Would you be willing to partner on a pilot project? She asked. We've been trying to design something like this for years. Teboho didn't answer right away. He looked at Zanel, then at the light bulb still glowing in his hand. I'm ready, he finally said. In the months that followed, he traveled more than he had in his entire life. Durban, Nairobi, Lagos, conferences, exhibitions, workshops. At first, he didn't know how to shake hands properly or read airport schedules. But he learned fast. He even started explaining his process in plain terms to engineers who had spent years in formal schools. And though he still worked from his small village shed, it was no longer hidden behind tarps and plastic. It had become a workshop with donated tools, solar panels, and a steel roof that didn't leak when it rained. But perhaps the biggest change wasn't external. Teboho had stopped hiding. He was no longer the invisible genius, no longer the strange boy collecting trash. He was the inventor who turned vibration into power and poverty into purpose. Still, the past had left its scars. Some nights, he would sit with Zanel under the stars, holding the old Popular Mechanics magazines in his lap. Do you think they'll ever return what they took? He asked. She looked at him, eyes steady. They can't. But what you build next, they can't take that from you. Today, if you travel to Qunu and ask around for Teboho Mokoena, most people will point toward the hill above the grazing fields, where a modest building now stands. It doesn't look like much from a distance, just a clean, silver roof structure with open windows and the occasional sound of children laughing. But inside that building, something extraordinary is happening. It's not a school. It's not quite a lab either. It's a makerspace, one of the few in rural South Africa. And every tool inside it was either built by Teboho himself or donated by those who believed in his story. On the wall hangs a small plaque that reads, uKhanya Innovation Center, where young minds light the future. It's not government funded. It's not part of any big initiative, but it's real. Every afternoon, after local kids finish their chores or schoolwork, they gather inside. They touch wires, break open radios, tinker with motors. And Teboho, now in his late 20s, walks among them not as a celebrity, but as a mentor. "I don't want them to be like me," he told a journalist once. "I want them to be better, to start building early, to never believe they have to wait for someone else's permission." He still remembers what it felt like to be dismissed, to be overlooked. And he has made it his life's mission to ensure no one in his community ever feels that way again. But things have changed far beyond his village. His name now appears in academic journals, referenced by energy researchers from Ghana to Germany. His kinetic power system, once cobbled together with old nails and rusted wires, is now being piloted in 7 African countries. Remote clinics in northern Kenya now use versions of his design to keep vaccines cold and lights on during power outages. Schools in rural Nigeria are using adapted models to power classroom projectors and charge learning tablets. And still, Teboho doesn't act like a man who's made it. He lives simply. His workshop is still behind his family's house, though now with a concrete floor and decent shelving. He still walks the same dirt paths to fetch tools or visit elders in the community. His hands are still stained with grease and ink. His voice still quiet and thoughtful. But ask anyone in Qunu and they'll tell you, he has the pride of the village. The boy they used to laugh at now brings international guests to their door. Journalists, students, inventors, they all come to meet the man who turned vibrations into energy and pain into progress. Sometimes, at dusk, Teboho walks to the edge of the hill where the old fig tree still stands. He sits beneath it with his journals now, dozens of them filled with new ideas, energy systems that use sound waves, low-cost prosthetic limbs powered by muscle motion, portable cooling units for farmers. He doesn't think of legacy. He thinks of problems and how to solve them. But on rare days, when the sky is clear and the mood is still, he reflects. "I used to think I needed someone to discover me," he told a classroom once. "But maybe we don't need to be discovered. Maybe we just need to build loud enough that the world can no longer ignore us." And that's what he's done. He didn't win a Nobel Prize. His name doesn't trend on Twitter. But what he's built both in machines and in minds will outlive any award. Still, there's a deep irony that lingers. Because outside of a few tech circles and academic spaces, the world still doesn't know Teboho's name. If you type African inventor into most search engines, you won't find him. You'll find the ones with foreign PR teams, or the ones whose inventions were made in labs, far removed from the realities of life in villages like Qunu. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy of his story, that even after changing lives across the continent, he remains, to most, forgotten, but not to us. Not to the girl who walks 5 kilometers in rural Eastern Cape to attend his weekend invention classes. Not to the clinic nurse in Turkana who now stores vaccines without fear of not to the boy in Mombasa who saw Teboho's TEDx talk on a cracked phone screen and thought, maybe I can build something too. Because in the end, recognition is fleeting, but impact real, grounded, human impact that's forever. And perhaps that's the message here. That Africa's greatest minds may not always wear suits or speak at global forums. Some of them are barefoot boys with soldered fingers and dreams bigger than their village. Some of them get their ideas stolen. Some of them rise. Anyway, Teboho's story is not a fairy tale. It's not clean or polished or handed to him. It's gritty. It's heartbreaking. It's honest. But it's also a story of reclamation. He may never reclaim the patents that were taken. He may never be paid for the ideas others sold. But what he has built with his own hands, his own pain, and his own brilliance, that belongs to him, that belongs to Africa, and to every young dreamer watching this, tucked away in a forgotten town or a noisy citino. You don't need permission to create. You don't need recognition to begin. You only need the courage to keep building, even when no one is watching. Because one day, they will. And when they do, let them find you. Not waiting but already lighting the way.